Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the start of the 2015-2016 Brown Bag Series hosted down here at the Division by the unit from up at Utah State, as well as Queen College Natural Resources, and of course all our partners down here at the Utah UDWR. So kicking off this year's series is going to be Tom Monaco, who's an ecologist with the USDA and stationed up at Utah State University. And he is a rangeland ecologist, working mostly on vegetation manipulations and looking for ways to improve and enhance restoration projects. Has some particular interest in legacy effects and how those affect the ability then to have restoration projects that do meet their objectives. So with that, go ahead and Tom, you can begin your talk today. So
thank you, Tom. It's my pleasure to be here today. It's also nice to see a bunch of old friends here, and all the people that I'm cooperating with are pretty much in the room. So you guys will keep me honest here. One of the common threads that we all have here is that we're interested in change, and we as land managers and land researchers, we recognize that change is just part of what we do, and we have hope that these changes will result in things that were intended. And so today, as I speak, just kind of think about that commonality that we all have, and that is assessing change. And what I'll be talking about today is a long time coming. It seems like the Watershed Restoration Initiative projects have been going on since about 2003 or 4, and the data sets are mature now, and we're to the point where we're starting to look at them. And so I just feel honored to be working with this group of people. And I'll get us started first by just acknowledging that the efforts to monitor and to implement these projects cost a lot of money, and as we all know, the state has supported that for many years and will continue to. The actual research money that we received to kind of initiate the assessment I'll be talking about today came from the Watershed Restoration Initiative, kind of a seed grant to help us get the data set in a format that we could start analyzing it. In addition to that, the U.S. Forest Service has recently funded us to assess the seedings that have been going on, because they're very interested also in understanding which plant materials are doing well when they're seeded. And then recently we were also funded by the DNR to bring on a postdoc to work with our graduate students to kind of expedite this whole process. So all of this would not have happened if there weren't some essential cooperators put in place. The ones closest to home where I live up in Logan is Kari Veblen and Eric Thacker on the faculty, same with Terry Mesmer, Dave Dahlgren, and Frank Cow. All of them were instrumental in kind of helping us get this off the ground and kind of give us some support in formulating some key questions. Also, of course, the Great Basin Research Center and NEPRM, they've been supportive of all this. They collect the data. They do a wonderful job supporting this effort by supplying the data, helping us clean up the data, and also for the feedback, ideas back and forth. And also with the USDA NRCS, they've been helping us clarify site classifications. For instance, we're using a common land classification system now, the Ecological Site Inventory System, to classify the sites that have all been treated so that we can start comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And so Jamin Johansson and Shane Green are still helping out with that effort. So today I'm going to first kind of open up, first to kind of give you a background to a small portion of the Watershed Restoration Initiative, and those are projects that have been going on to reduce woody plants, okay? But in order to really kind of set the stage here, we really need to understand some of the problems that are associated with woody plant encroachment, because it really kind of indicates that restoration truly is needed. And then I'm going to kind of briefly go into the assessment methods that we used to do the first cut of data analysis, just to kind of figure out what's going on, what are some of the trends, develop some hypotheses so that we can delve in a little bit deeper with some directed studies. And so my intention today was to give you two different case studies, because I think both of those projects have matured enough So I wanted to give you an idea of what's going on with some of the pinyon juniper treated areas. But I also wanted to give you an idea of what's going on with all the sagebrush treated areas, but there just isn't enough time today. And so I'm going to focus just on the case study number 3 for time purposes today, then give you an idea of where we're going with the future direction with this cooperative group. So first of all, let's kind of start off by talking about some of the problems associated with woody plant encroachment. And how many in the crowd here understand the term woody plant encroachment? Joe? Okay. All right. Basically it's a global phenomenon that people are starting to attribute to many different complex interacting factors, okay? And, you know, just to sum it up, some recent people who have assessed protocols for reducing woody plants have come to the conclusion that woody plant encroachment represents a threat to many different ecosystems, including grasslands, shrub steppe, savanna, as well as the plants and animals that exist in these communities. So that's kind of the introduction to why we need to be thinking about encroachment and what are we going to do about it. So just to kind of give you a quick slice of some of the impacts that it might have for wildlife. For instance, with juniper encroachment, it's pretty clear, and there's been a lot of different studies that support that the conclusion that it diminishes sagebrush applicant species, and I'll go into that a little bit more detail. Also, I like this term overage sagebrush stands with many different pressures that have happened since European settlement throughout the West. It's pretty common knowledge now that there are some overage stands that need to be treated because when they get to be a certain age and they don't have the younger structural diversity that you would see in an area that provides a lot of different type of habitat heterogeneity, it diminishes forage potential not only for livestock but also habitat quality for birds as well as big game. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here, so what you see here in this picture is your basic picture of juniper. Juniper, where it occurs within a sagebrush matrix here. And this is a particular photo that was taken in 1977. And what I'm going to do is toggle back and forth to give you an idea of what is really meant by expansion and encroachments. Two different things might be going on there. You can see canopies expanding, but also you'll see encroachment, new plants establishing, kind of marching along and taking up habitat that used to be sagebrush habitat. So I'll just toggle back and forth to kind of see this picture. So you can see both of those processes going on at the same time. All right? And so really, what are the threats that have been documented? First off, conifers, when they invade, they have big issues going on with understory vegetation because it becomes sparse and species diversity starts to decline, especially on the shallow soils. Shrub diversity and cover declines. It also alters the fuel loads and increases the potential for crown fires, which burn much differently. Also, you know, an obvious one is it reduces wildlife habitat, and management can become quite costly, and exotic species may invade. So here are some of the threats, and then here's some further backup for why we would want to reduce junipers in these types of systems. First off is to reduce fuel loads, and planning for the future, we want to reduce the size and severity of fires, improve landscape heterogeneity, increase forage production, increase sagebrush cover, enhance watershed functioning, improve wildlife habitat, and increase the resilience to disturbance and resistance to invasion. So getting ahead of the problem through the restoration initiative is very important so that we can start to be aware of some of these changes that have occurred and start to improve the land before it gets too bad. And so many of you are probably very familiar with the Watershed Restoration Initiative. I won't spend too much time talking about it, but this is a slide that I've borrowed again and again. It's basically a partnership-driven effort, And the idea is to conserve and restore and manage ecosystems based on priority areas, and some of the priorities include wildlife and biological diversity, water quality and yield, and to provide greater opportunities for sustainable uses. We all know that these lands are not just for the wildlife, but they're also being grazed by livestock, and that really complicates the issue. So the Watershed Restoration Initiative has a very, very broad purpose to improve lands. And one of the key things, at least in my mind, that really came to play to make all this possible were that there was, first off, there was a tremendous equipment need as well as a monitoring need to be in place in order for us to assess these changes once a treatment site has been selected and a project goes out. And so what you can see here is that there's many different sagebrush areas here that have been targeted, and they're considered focus areas, and that's where these projects go on. So instead of just kind of willy-nilly putting out a project area, these are within focus areas where the likelihood of success may be a little bit greater. There's a lot of thought and process that goes into selecting these projects and the sites. And of course, the monitoring is in place there so we can assess what happened. Because in order to be involved in this program, you have to have a pre as well as post treatment monitoring so that we can identify what happened. So this kind of gives you an idea of what is really meant by watershed restoration. You can see the large scale here. I can't remember exactly who originally put this slide together, but you can see here that it's at large scales. They think about large areas, and in this case here, they're putting out heterogeneous types of treatments. And this is just what they look like across the landscape. And oftentimes, not only is conifer shrubs being reduced, but they've followed up with seeding. And the whole idea is to provide much better habitat. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the assessment methods that we used to kind of go throughout the data set and come to some quick conclusions. First off, there's a lot of challenges when you deal with big data sets like this. For example, you can't just study them all and put them into the little bins because they're so different to begin with. And if you're looking at a gradient of variation like this, just from the start, you immediately kind of view it as an obstacle. And so, you know, this just gives you an idea of the differences in sagebrush and pinyon juniper cover on 68 of the sites that I'm going to be showing you some data for. A second challenge is that the interaction between woody plants and herbaceous species is still pretty poorly understood. You know, it's a hot topic in research still. There's a lot of theories out there. What this diagram here shows is that there's three primary theories that have emerged within the literature showing the relationship between grass and tree. You know, and what's shown here is a general inverse relationship, but what this one focuses here is that the trees and grasses have different niches, okay? And there's a stable location at a given site. Another possible theory that describes their interaction would be competitive exclusion, where you can see here where the trees have excluded the grass. And then, of course, we know that in our systems that we work in, things aren't always a straight line. They're not linear. We have non-linear types of responses here. And in the case here, when both responses are non-linear, you can have two different stable conditions. So what that means to us is that a site can exist in two different states. And that is one of the challenges that we have to grapple with. And just to give you an idea of, you know, some of my own personal data, when I've looked at the relationship between grass cover and shrub cover, I come up with this in some cases. But other sites, it totally falls apart. But really, what each one of these dots is a different site. Okay? And so when you look at the collection of a lot of different sites, this pattern might start to emerge. But you know, if you're working on a site like this and you do the same type of treatment that you might do on a site like that, I mean, you're just going to have totally different types of responses.
Does this sort of typify a Great Basin ecosystem, or would this be the whole United States?
This one here, is a collection of sites where in the 1950s they removed all the shrubs and seeded crested wheatgrass. So this is about 38 different sites. And so this may not be typical, but this type of site exists. And one of the third challenges that we face here is that treatment and sampling years are not consistent. And that can be a challenge because one year is different than the next year. And what I'm showing here in these little arrows is a realistic way that these watershed restoration initiative sites have been monitored. They monitored them, for example, in 1999, and then they put in a treatment here that might be close to 2003, but then it's monitored in 2004, and then again in 2009. And you can see that this site had a different type of setup. It might have been monitored in those 2 years, but then the treatment went in here, and then we monitored again here. So, treatment and sampling years make it a little bit difficult to just jump straight in and start analyzing the data. And the fourth challenge is that these were not technically set up as experiments. They don't have controls per se, because oftentimes the crews that go out and measure these things, they have time to go and assess their set transects, and they don't go out and measure control areas, and that can be a potential challenge. And so one of the solutions that we came up with in order to just keep moving with the data analysis was to use effect size analysis, and that's a real common tool that people use because it's suitable for taking data from a lot of different sites, and these sites might have variable years of treatment and all that, and it standardizes every response by its pre-treatment, and that's how we kind of constructed our statistics, and I'll get into that in a second. And what the statistic really tries to do is create an effect size. So what we did in this case here is we just took the pre-data and divided it by the post-data and took the log of that. So it's a real simple statistic, but it was a way for us to kind of standardize all the different treatment sites to kind of see what's the magnitude of change that occurred after a treatment. And so I'm going to just kind of quickly go into the case study that I'll be covering today, and once again I only have time to kind of talk about the conifer reduction studies. And this study here was set up here by Kevin Gunnell, who's in the crowd, and he identified 68 different sites, and he had to select among them because he wanted to make sure we had the pre and the post data, and we had enough replication of a couple different types of treatments. First of all, when you sample across 68 different sites, you're going to have high spatial and temporal variability. When we classified the sites, it came down to that we were actually monitoring and assessing 32 different ecological sites that covered 7 different MLRAs, pretty broad range in elevation, and the 3 focus treatments that we chose to look at were the mastication treatments, where I'll show you a photograph here, where basically the conifer trees are chewed up and the litter is dropped on the ground. Chaining, most of us are familiar with chaining. A large chain is pulled across the landscape and the conifer trees are pulled over and moved. And then lop and scatter, which is just cut down the tree and more or less drop them or scatter them around. So these are 3 different treatments that have very different effects on the soil surface. They're going to affect hydrology differently. They're going to affect the recovery of the plant community quite differently. And so here's what lop and scatter looks like, and it's typically done in phase 1. Now I'm going to throw that term out. Phase 1 is a woodland successional term that would indicate that the conifer trees are relatively sparse still. The understory is pretty well intact. Canopies aren't touching, and it's usually done with just a chainsaw. Compare that to mastication treatments. It's a larger implement on a treaded vehicle. They go up to the trees and they grind them down and leave the mulch there on the ground, thus the term mastication. And that's typically done it's done in lots of different phases of woodland expansion, but typically used in phase 1 or 3. And then there's chaining. We're probably all most familiar with chaining because it's been used for so many years. And it's typically done in phase 2 and 3 where the woodlands have expanded so much that it's just more cost effective to take a lot of trees out at once. So that gives you kind of a quick view of the 3 different treatments I'll be covering here. And so, as you are probably all aware, the monitoring of this is all done through the statewide program for the long-term range study monitoring. And a couple people here have been involved in that. Probably most people who have been in the division long enough have taken part in that. And so that's where the data sets came from. And I'm going to kind of briefly go into that. So the sampling procedure is conserved. It means they use the same method when they go to a site, and it usually it always consists of setting up a larger transect, which that's about 500 feet. Then there's replicated belts, which gives me the replication of 5 when we start to analyze things. And in addition to that, along each of the belts, there's replication for us to put down small frames or quadrats to measure things spatially across the site. And so each of the sites we view as an experimental unit. Okay, we're not pooling data from different sites or anything like that. We view each site as an independent unit. So we're interested in knowing what did that treatment site do over time. And as I mentioned earlier, the analysis is pretty straightforward. In order for us to get a kind of a rough and dirty estimate of how these treatments played out, we took the pre and post monitoring data and we broke it up into different time frames so we could get kind of an idea of successional processes. And for example, 1 to 3, we had a lot of different sites that had just been treated. 4 to 6, we had a little bit fewer, and by the time we get out to 7 to 9 years, there's fewer and fewer numbers of those sites. Okay, but keep in mind that our statistics are always kind of weighted by the number of sites we have. And so we use the effect size analysis, and in other words, it's just kind of taking a meta-analysis type of approach to contrasting these treatments over time. And the things I'll be touching on today are some vegetation categories as well as the ground cover types of categories like bare ground and litter. We think those are important for us to keep tracking. So let's just jump into some of the research questions that initially kind of captivated us and kind of brought us together. Some of the research questions that we came up with were, do the treatments equally enhance understory components? Are there some treatments that are better than others? And also, how effective are seeding treatments? We know that a lot of sites have this ability to recover on their own. And if we can identify certain sites that have a greater capacity to be more resilient like that, we'd like to know which ones they are. And because seeding is expensive. So which species are most successful? That's also an important component of this. A lot of time and effort goes into plant material development. I work in a lab where we have basically 12 scientists. 10 of them work entirely on developing plant materials for restoration. So when I went to my boss and told him I was going to do this type of work, he said, go for it. He was really excited that I could work with this team. Because we want to know which species are actually working. Because we can use that as a feedback loop to continue working on certain species and dropping other species. And we hope to get at some of the mechanisms why some of the species are working and others are not. And another question that kind of came up is that we know that sites differ in their potential. And what I mean by that is, some sites have the potential to become just a PJ stand. Other ones might have a greater potential to remain as a sagebrush stand. And so knowing that these different potentials exist, we did a quick contrast just to kind of whet our appetite to see what would happen if we went much, much deeper with this concept of categorically looking at different types of responses within ecological sites. And so I'm going to kind of cruise through some of these results because hopefully I can give one explanation for what these graphics look like and then we can spend more time maybe just discussing some of the results. But first of all, what we have here on this axis here are the different treatments. Hopefully you can see that in the back. Shauna, can you see this okay?
I can, yep.
Okay, so what we have are the three treatments that I discussed. We have mastication treatment, chaining, and then lop and scatter. And then what we're looking at here is the mean effect size. And so the way we interpret this is if the effect size is larger than 0, then that means that this variable saw an increase between the pre and the post, okay? So after a treatment, what did it do? And in this case here, it's showing that all the treatments at the different time frames, and they have different sites that were involved in the analysis, we can see that pretty much across the board, the bare ground was decreased at all time frames. So when you go out and reduce pinyon juniper, you're going to see significantly less bare ground in most cases. And this is what had happened with litter. And once again, here's the 0 line. If something's on the right side, in the case here, you can see that the amount of litter on the ground that's protecting the soil surface and possibly slowing down overflow and providing litter for just soil protection. It's basically increased pretty much across the board. Let's take a look at some other of these categories. Now, annual grasses, you know, we've known for a long time that annual grasses, we don't have a lot of native annual grasses within our system here. And in fact, most of these are invasive plants. And one of the consequences of disturbing the soil in these ecosystems is that you can see an increase in annual grasses. And hopefully you can see here is that the two treatments that tend to disturb the soil a little bit more, like for instance chaining, you can see that the annual grasses increase much more than in the mastication and lop and scatter. Lop and scatter treatments don't really create much disturbance relative to the others, and that's why you can see that it didn't really affect it. But I guess the good point is that after 7 to 9 years, the annual grasses started to diminish somewhat. Perennial grasses, keep in mind here that, you know, some of these treatments here were seeded, and so you would expect that perennial grass would increase, but a lot of this perennial grass increase may also be associated with the reduction in conifers and the herbaceous species being able to respond because there's more resources available to them. So this is a really a strong positive effect that we're excited to see. Annual forbs are kind of all across the board. There's a tendency for areas that are disturbed more due to chaining to have a little bit more of these annual forbs. And keep in mind that a lot of these annual forbs might be exotic species that may not be necessarily desirable. And perennial forbs, a lot of time and money goes into seeding these, and these are very important for wildlife species and for the nutritional quality of the site. It's nice to see that these seeded areas, these particular two treatments that the perennial forbs are establishing, and they're doing well post-treatment in pretty much all time frames. And then one of the other key questions, well, what happens to sagebrush when you remove the conifers? And that's pretty interesting to look at here. In the mastication treatments here, it's not really until you get out to 7 to 9 years that we started to see a significant improvement in the sagebrush. Whereas for the other treatments, it really didn't change much, at least within these time frames that we're looking at and for these few sites that we considered in the analysis. Hopefully you can see that. However, if you look at all shrubs, you can see that, you know, in general, the shrub component of these ecosystems increased. A lot of that is due to younger, disturbance adapted species like rabbit brush and other types of shrubs are starting to increase because they're more disturbance adapted. But the thing is that needs to be looked at much closer.
Did you include in this beneficial shrubs versus non-beneficial?
This is just all shrubs, but the trees or like the young PJ plants are not included in this.
Where would broom snakeweed?
It would be here too. Broom snakeweed, and
That's
so
too bad.
Yeah, so, but that's one of the directed studies that we need to start looking at now.
And on that note, it was a minor component actually on both sides.
Yeah.
It was a major component on these 68 sides.
Yeah, so, but this gives us kind of a first cut and some ideas of some things we need to look at much, much closer.
Hey, can I add one note there too? Another note is this is all cover-based, not density-based, and so the trends of increasing the density is higher sometimes than the cover is.
That's a good point. I'll be showing some density-based data here in a minute when we look at the seedings. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what happened with the vegetation in response to all these conifer reduction treatments. Keep in mind, there's 68 of them, and these are the numbers that we have to play with here. Each year we'll add new data to the mix here. Kevin and I are currently working on a manuscript and hopefully get that out here pretty quick. I'll show you some of the new elements that we're adding to that manuscript as we speak. First of all, let me just kind of put some of this into context. So, treatments have big effects, but do all sites respond alike? I kind of alluded to this earlier, that we know that ecological sites kind of function differently. And probably the most obvious difference in ecological sites would be this contrast between encroached sites, and that is, these are possibly mountain and Wyomingensis sites that have been encroached by pinyon juniper, okay? Now, you would contrast that with the PJ site where it would be classified as a woodland site. So the question is, do woodlands, ecological sites, or the PJ ones, respond differently than sagebrush sites that have been encroached? Do you guys see where I'm going with this? Okay. So what we did with that is we looked at some really quick statistics to kind of answer that. So let me kind of arrange your minds around what these figures are. So let's talk about sagebrush cover first, and here's the pre-treatment data. And then we took it out to 7 to 9 years post-treatment. And what we're contrasting here are the encroached sites, the encroached sagebrush sites versus the PJ woodland sites that have been treated, okay? They've both been treated, but in the pre-treatment, it's pretty obvious that the encroached sites had much higher sagebrush to begin with, okay? And so we're eating a lot of that variability when we do a meta-analysis, okay? So when we start to dice things apart a little bit, we can start to tease out and put some more context into this, okay? However, after 7 to 9 years, you can see here that, sagebrush was increasing up to the point where it equaled the encroached sites when it was a PJ site. So what I'm saying there is that they differed before they were treated. In fact, the encroached sites had much higher sagebrush. However, the sagebrush increased quite a bit in the PJ sites to match it, okay? So that's what's going on. That gives us a little bit more context. Another contrast that we can look at here is a perennial forest. They didn't differ between encroached ecological sites and PJ sites before the treatments were put out. But after 7 to 9 years,